Hi there, and welcome back to My Catholic Perspective. I am Allie Marie, a born and raised Michigander, and somebody who just likes to ask questions and research and read and learn as much as I can so that I can have a better understanding of what I believe and the world around me. Every last Thursday of the month, I'm doing my best to do a book review, and this month I happen to be doing one that one of my patrons actually sent me. I have a Patreon account so that I just have a little bit of income coming from this channel to support what I do by posting every Thursday, and this one was actually sent to me by Scott Herbin, who's one of my propagators over on Patreon, and it's Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist by Dr. Brant Pitre, and it's Unlocking the Secrets of the Last Supper. So this was a very dense book. It was very good. It was chock full of information. I always talk about how there are just always so many more layers of Catholicism, and that is exactly what this book brought to the surface. And I have 3 pages worth of an outline that I'm going to try to get through fairly quickly just because of wanting to keep the video short, but also my daughter's down for a nap. I'm hoping to beat her before she wakes up, so we'll see how it goes. I will be uploading this outline to Patreon. I'm debating between whether I'm going to make it just public to everybody, or if you just need to be a $1 patron, just be a Catholic alligator, but just head over there to check it out if you wanted to print it off to follow along throughout this video. So to start, I want to talk about my history with the Judeo-Christian roots. I converted Catholic when I was 21 years old, so I've been Catholic for about 7 years. I was raised Reformed. I went to a private Christian school system, and it was like a Dutch Reformed style, so Christian CRC type learning, Calvinist based. And in 3rd grade, we actually reunited a Seder meal, and it wasn't like a formal, here's a religious devout thing that we're doing. It was more of a, here are the bitter herbs, here's the sauce that they use, here's the lamb, and this is the order that it goes in. And I think that as a child, having that hands-on learning really helped me, especially in understanding what Dr. Pitre was talking about in this book, because I felt like I had already experienced it. I did a poll on Instagram to see how many of my followers over on Instagram had ever attended a Seder meal, and 72% said that they never had. And then furthermore, I polled, do you know what is involved in that? And 62% said no. So with our faith being rooted in Judaism, with Christ himself having been a Jew, where he actually says salvation comes from the Jews in John 4, we have kind of a moral imperative to understand where those roots are. What is the substantial piece of why does the Passover matter? What is the Last Supper? What was Jesus reenacting? What was he instating? What were Jews of the 1st century looking for in the coming of a Messiah? And the Catechism even goes into some of these Jewish roots. It goes into, a bunch of these different things, which I'm going to get into later. But understanding where we come from and what the foundation of our religion actually is really important to be able to explain to others why we believe what we believe, why we believe that the physical body and blood of Christ is present in the Eucharist. With a Pew survey that had come out earlier this year about how only 33% of the people that are in Catholic pews actually believe that it's the physical body and blood of Christ. It's a little disheartening. Like, that is one of the things that drew me into the faith. That is one of the reasons I chose to convert, was because I saw that this was Christ. Like, this is the face of Christ within the Eucharist. And Dr. Pitre definitely gets into all of that. He has his PhD from Notre Dame. He has studied all the ancient languages and the ancient Jewish traditions, and gone into all these ancient Jewish writings and rabbinic writings and all of these different things that end up playing into why we believe what we believe about the Last Supper, about why we believe that Christ's death on the cross was more than just an execution, but it was actually a sacrifice. So those are a few pieces that I just want to chat about today. So getting into Dr. Pitre's book. He has a lecture that he does called Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist, and I had decided, I'm a big read the book, then watch the movie kind of person. So I was like, I have to finish this book before I can watch his lecture. I have to finish the book, so I'm going to focus on that, and then I'll do the lecture, and I'll kind of compare the two. Hands down, watch the lecture first. In his book, it was almost comical. I actually started laughing when I would start seeing it, because for the first couple chapters, he'd like go on and on and on. He'd be like, the main point here is, and on and on. The main point here is, on and on. The main point here is, and then in the last chapters, he shifted to in short. I bet he said in short in this book at least 30 times. It was like literally, I was like pointing it to I was like, oh, there it is again. There it is again. So in his lecture, though, all of his in shorts are what he focuses on. And I think that if you're looking, like if you watch the lecture and you still have further questions, that's where this book would be helpful, because he goes into the specific linguistic pieces that he's talking about, and he just goes further in depth with quoting the Mishnah and quoting all the different pieces of ancient Jewish literature. That would be my recommendation. So I'm going to link that above in a card and then below as well, but definitely check out the lecture first. And basically, as I said, he goes into examining how a first century Jew would have perceived Jesus. What did they believe? How would they have understood everything that he was saying? So my biggest takeaways, which I have these 3 pages worth of big takeaways, but they boil down to the bread of the presence, which was in the tabernacle, the 4 cups of wine, and how the Passover was laid out, how Jesus drank the 4th cup on the cross, and then talking about manna and Christ's abilities for miracles, and how that looks with having water to wine, wine to blood, and even with Moses changing water to blood in the Nile River. So a lot of these pieces, I'm going to start here with the bread of the presence. So growing up, learning about the Ark of the Covenant, learning about the tabernacle, it was always focused on, like, the biggest thing was the Holy of Holies, the thing behind the veil. Only the priest was allowed there. It held the manna, Aaron's staff, and the 10 commandments. Those were the main things that I learned about in school. And outside of the veil, before you enter the Holy of Holies, you had a golden table that held the menorah and the bread of the presence. And so the bread of the presence is something that is not talked about as much, but is actually really substantial in Jewish history. So the Hebrew phrase for it is lahem ha-panim, which means, like, literally panim means face. So it actually is the bread of the face. So it was understood that this bread was the face of God. It was after Moses went up onto Mount Sinai and he feasted with God when he received the 10 commandments, that God told him to build this golden table to hold the bread of the presence. And so Moses, nobody could see the face of God or he would die, as it stated in Exodus. And so he came forward and he built this golden table, and every Sunday, every Sabbath, it was offered as a non-bloody sacrifice. So Jewish people in the ancient tradition, they had bloody and non-bloody sacrifices. The bloody sacrifice is that of a lamb or a goat, and they would sacrifice it, and the means that they would sacrifice I'm going to get into in a second, but they have the bloody sacrifice and the non-bloody, which was always in the form of bread and wine. So with the bread of the presence, you had 12 loaves of bread, which represented the 12 tribes of Israel, which when we look at the Last Supper, we see the 12 apostles. This offering was actually a memorial offering done in remembrance. So there were also different types of sacrifices that were made. There were Thanksgiving sacrifices and different types, but this particular one was a memorial sacrifice, which ties into how Christ says, do this in remembrance of me. He makes the Last Supper a memorial sacrifice and in remembrance of me. So in this case, with the bread of the presence, this non-bloody sacrifice is to remember how they were redeemed from Egypt, how they were rescued from slavery and also from the angel of death. And so after this bread was consecrated, after the priest prayed over it, which the priest was the only person who could consume the bread of the presence, it couldn't be placed on a marble table anymore, and it had to go on the gold. So it shows that Jewish people did not revere the bread of the presence as just ordinary bread. It was very, it was miraculous. It was this serious thing that was to be respected and upheld, and even going into first century, they were told that they had to see the face of God 3 times a year, and that's when they would journey to Jerusalem, and they would see, the priest would hold up the bread and say, "Behold God's love for you," and they would look at the bread of the presence, or the bread of the face. So the bread of the presence is something that is very often overlooked, that ends up playing into how, when Christ does his bread of life discourse, it plays into how he is connected with that. So at the Passover meal, this is kind of like the next, it's the Passover Seder. Seder means order. So it's the Hebrew order of this meal. And there are 4 cups of wine that basically give the order of the meal. So first century Jews, first and foremost, would have believed that a new Exodus, this was what they were waiting for with the awaited Messiah, was a new Exodus would mean a new Passover, because the Passover is what set in motion the escape from Egypt. So this was with the 10th plague, and that was where the angel of death was coming. They had to slaughter a perfect lamb, 1-year-old, no imperfections, all of these things. Then they had to put the blood of the lamb on their doorpost so that the angel of death would go over their house and their firstborn child would not be killed. The way that this lamb was killed was similar to a crucifixion. So they actually would stick a stake up the back and across the arms, so it actually hung as if it was crucified. And they couldn't break any of its bones because they didn't want to mar any of the perfection that was within the lamb, and they would just slit the throat and drain the blood out, and that blood was actually dumped in the tabernacle at the temple, and it's just this whole site. The book goes into it more detailed than I care to. But the sacrifice of the lamb was not completed until the lamb was consumed at the Passover meal. So it had to be a Levitical priest that sacrificed the lamb, and they had to go take the lamb to the priest. My daughter just woke up. They had to take the lamb to the priest to sacrifice for them, and then they had to take it back and cook the lamb and consume it. So that the sacrifice wasn't complete until the consumption. In addition to that, Jews were forbidden to drink the blood of any animal because it was believed that the life or the soul was within the blood of the animal. The Hebrew word for that was nephesh. And so when we look at Christ telling us that we have to drink his blood, it's totally contradictory to what these Jewish teachings have been for however long. And now suddenly we're saying, but he's saying you have to drink my blood or there's no life within you. But the soul and the life is within his blood. So the 4 cups of wine that are presented at the Passover are the introductory rite, which is the cup of sanctification, which is known as the Kaddish cup. The second cup is the proclamation of Scripture, which is the Haggadah cup. And then the third is the eating of the meal, or the cup of the blessing, which is the Barakah cup. And then concluding rites where Psalm 118 would be sung, and the cup would then be consumed after singing the hymn. So the layout of this is important because when we look at Jesus in the Last Supper, in the book of Luke, it's actually indicative that they had multiple cups at the Last Supper, but it also indicates that the 4th cup was never consumed. So I believe that Dr. Pitre has a book called The 4th Cup, and he goes into all the details of further than he does in this book, I'm sure. But he says that the 2nd and the 3rd cup make the most sense due to how the dinner was progressing, because you eat the meal with this cup and you do everything else. I could spend a lot of time going into all the specifics, but basically the important part is that usually the hymn is sung and then they drink the cup, and then that is when Passover would be done. They are said in the book of Luke to be singing the hymn as they go out to Gethsemane, where Christ actually prays, "Let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done." So he's indicating that The fourth cup was never consumed. As he was led to his crucifixion, he was offered wine with gall that he refused. He would not drink. And finally, though, right before he died, he said, "I thirst." He actually requested wine, and there was a basin of wine. They gave it to him. And right after he drank it, he said, "It is finished," and he died. So the interpretation there would be that when he consumed that wine, he was actually drinking the fourth cup of the Passover, which ended up joining the Last Supper and to include his death and suffering, to say that he actually extended his final Passover meal to make the entire deal a sacrifice. So it's all, he essentially finished the Passover meal on the cross. And I think it's, it's important to know, one of my Jewish friends actually was just talking to me about this, how, Pascha means Passover. And so Christ is our Paschal Lamb. And the Eucharist is our Paschal Mystery. So it's no coincidence that we would have these connections between what Passover is and how it goes into our faith. The Catechism even joins the Last Supper with the new Passover in paragraph 608, 612, 1000. The Catechism also joins the Last Supper with the new Passover in paragraph 608, 612, 1334, and 1339 to 1340. So Dr. Pitre, he talks about all of those paragraphs in his book. I'm hoping that I'm not totally butchering this and you're able to follow along with what I'm trying to share. There's a lot of information, and I'm really impressed that he was able to put it together so succinctly. But finally, these last 2 points are a little more for me, they were things that influenced my conversion in general. Dr. Pitre even mentions on page 188 of his book that there's so much depth to the Catholic faith, and there's just so much there waiting to be rediscovered anew. Because he had discussed this when he had spent a lot of time dissecting a particular word that described the bread in the Lord's Prayer, because it was the word epiousios, which ended up being super substantial or supernatural, which is how the Jews viewed the manna. So when Christ said, he said, "Give us this day our epiousios bread," which was our supernatural bread, indicating that this is the new manna. So this point is about Christ as the new manna. Jews viewed manna as bread from heaven. It was known as the bread of the angels, because in the Mishnah, Jews believed that the manna was one of the 10 things that was created on the eve of the 7th day of creation, meaning it pre-existed the world. It has been reserved from the beginning, and it was super substantial. It was supernatural substance. So the Jews were actually waiting for manna to return with the coming of the Messiah, according to the Midrash Rabbah. So John 1 obviously indicates the Word became flesh. We have these indications that he did come down from heaven. Jesus himself in John 6 says that he is the bread that has come down from heaven in his Bread of Life discourse. He could have compared himself with a Passover lamb at that point, but instead compares himself to the manna that came down from heaven. He compares himself to being that super substantial bread. And there was something earlier that I forgot to say in general, but the super substantial bread. Oh, what was it? I don't know. Anyway, I don't know. But so he compares himself to that manna that comes down from heaven. Oh, I remember. It's the fact that the bread of the presence, the bread of the face, it's a perpetual offering. It's a perpetual sacrifice, and that's what Christ did. That was what the Jews were awaiting. They were awaiting for the manna to come back to them eternally. It was promised that it would return, and then it wasn't going to leave again. Whereas when they were wandering the desert, it was with them for those 40 years. And then once they reached the promised land, the manna stopped. And so with the coming of the Messiah, they were actually promised that the manna would return, and it wasn't going to leave them. It was going to be with them in perpetuity, which is what the offering of the bread of the presence was, which ended in 70 AD when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. So finally, and this was one that Dr. Petre expanded for my understanding, when I was deciding whether or not I wanted to convert, I saw, that Christ changed the water to wine at the wedding of Cana for his first miracle. And I'm like, well, if he can change a substance, of course he can change. Why wouldn't he be able to change wine to his blood? Like, that just makes sense to me. Why would we, believe that, but then put a limitation on something else? But Dr. Petre takes it a step forward in putting Jesus in the shoes of the new Moses, which is what the Jews were waiting for. They were waiting for a new Moses, for a new Solomon, something greater than the temple to come to earth. And when we see that first plague that Moses did in Egypt, where he changed the Nile River to blood, we see right there that replication, that foreshadowing of that ability to change a substance to blood. Moses skipped the wine. He went straight water to blood. So now we have Jesus, who has proven that he can do water to wine, and then later on wine to blood. So when we have this piece of the new Moses looking at water to wine, wine to blood, there is that deal where Moses himself took water and it went to blood. So if we do truly believe these miracles that happened in the Old Testament, if we truly believe the roots on where we come from, what our Catholic faith, the heart of our Catholic faith, if we examine that, we will see that there are so many dots that are connected. We will see that there's just so much edification in everything that we're taught from day one, and ultimately able to have a discussion with somebody about how all of this is interconnected, how the Catholic faith has instituted, that Christ did institute that new Passover, and the Catholic Church has preserved it, with the different founding fathers defending the fact that it is actually the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, that it does turn into the physical body and blood of Christ, that we should not be fooled by the taste of bread and the taste of wine, and that Christ truly is there, body, soul, and divinity. And it has just been, I'm very thankful. Thank you, Scott, for sending me this book, because it was just really insightful and very in-depth on so much of what I kind of knew on, this level. But like I said, the Catholic faith, it has all of these layers. It's always deeper. There's so much richness and history in it that we could, there's no way that I could ever know everything. There's no way that any of us could. And so we all have our individual passions. And I just strongly recommend that if you're interested in kind of learning about all of this on a deeper level, Dr. Petre's video is 1 hour and 10 minutes long that I'm going to be linking. You can check that out. And then if you're interested still further, I definitely recommend this book, just to, find out where the substance is, find out where the true depth is in what he's talking about and where our roots truly come from. I do hope that I was able to keep you engaged and that I didn't lose you too much. And I just really pray that God is able to grant you the resources that you need to draw closer to him and to those around you. And I pray that as masses resume around the country, that we're able to see Christ, see the face of Christ in the Eucharist, and just see everything that he left for us then, everything that was foreshadowed before, and everything that is here for us now. God bless you, and I look forward to seeing you again next week, Thursday at 3.